though.
Yeah. Big place.
Yeah.
Okay, so everyone should be in now, coming in now.
Where's the whiskey bar, Jack?
Right outside the door.
Okay. All right, we are good to go. You're recording.
Sorry.
Okay. Good morning, Larry.
Good morning. Sorry, I'm late.
No problem, man. No problem. You're not late. We haven't started. Like to call the meeting to order and request a roll call.
Director Bregman,
Present.
Director Gibson,
Here.
Director Kohler,
I'm here.
Director Schmidt,
Here.
and Chair Russell.
Here. Okay, like a motion to adopt the agenda.
Move
So
approve
moved.
the agenda. Second.
Roll call, please.
Director Bregman,
Aye.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Director Kohler,
Aye.
Director Schmidt,
Aye.
and Chair Russell.
Aye.
Larry, did you
I'd
have
like
any comment on
public
the
comment.
agenda? Sorry about that.
Oh, I apologize. No, there are none.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'd like the motion to approve the minutes.
Move approval.
Second.
Second.
Okay.
Roll call.
Director Bregman,
Aye.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Director Kohler,
Aye.
Director Schmidt,
Aye.
and Chair Russell.
Aye. Okay, item number 2, emergency intertie project update.
Good morning. Paul Cellier, Operations Director. I am going to share my screen. And we'll get going here. Before I get going, I'd like to introduce Xavier Arias with Woodard and Curran. He is our project and program manager with Woodard and Curran, who are helping us not only coordinate all the activities of our consulting groups on this project, but also helping us through water transfers as well. So please welcome Zav. Zav will be here to help me if there are any questions from the board that I can't answer in enough detail. So today's update on the intertie is also contains information that support the following item, which is to say the feasibility contract amendments. Our update today will take us through a review of our drought project alternatives. And we'll touch on schedule, the status to date of the emergency intertie project, before getting into a little bit of detail on the pipeline alignment options and issues on the bridge. And then we're going to pivot and introduce the board to the project team who's helping guide us through these issues. And we'll take a brief look at the scope of the agreements and feasibility to complete feasibility and water transfers and wheeling. And as we conclude with some key milestones for the board to consider and outline our next steps. So we've seen this before, our drought project alternatives, conservation, we're continuing as our top priority to refine and enhance this. We are continuing again to work with Sonoma Water to collaborate on any and all opportunities. And there's some recent analysis that we've been reviewing with them. Recycled water, we understand recycled water in our service area very well, having studied it over the years. And there really are no short-term expansion options that would help us in the context of this drought. Accordingly,
Paul, can I ask you a question? Sorry to break in. On recycled water. The rebuilt plant up at Las Galinas sort of went to a higher level of treatment, didn't it? Ultrafiltration or something to that effect?
They did. They changed it. So we had a slightly more conventional treatment process, and they have a membrane treatment process, but they essentially produce very similar water qualities.
And so my question is, have we looked into adding an RO unit to that facility?
Not specifically to that unit, but that certainly could be done. However, you would be looking at a host of challenges, as we are with any of these options. But we do understand, how that could be done. That there is no paradigm at the moment for direct to drinking water, right, from that plant. So we'd be looking maybe at moving it up to one of our reservoirs.
Right, right. So it's just, I think when we talk about recycled water, I mean, that was mentioned in the CMSA feasibility study, and it's just something that's been brought up to me. And as far as really making a decision, long-term decision, something that I think the board should at least consider. So,
Yeah, there's
sorry.
a big difference, Larry, between CSMA and Las Colinas, though. The Las Colinas is primarily our water, and it's very low salt, where CSMA has all that infiltration. That's why CSMA was, if CSMA water had been better quality, we would already have the recycled water in the shopping center by the ferry boats. But because it's so salty, we can't do that. That's why they needed the RO on CSMA.
Right, and my suggestion is consider adding an RO unit to Las Colinas and to determine whether that's feasible.
But why?
Because you could create possibly potable water supply that you pump up into one of the reservoirs.
Oh, sure, but that's not going to happen until December of 23. So,
Okay,
you know,
well,
Yes.
we're rushing
that's
right
when the
along.
state rules
Okay.
change.
I don't want to distract Paul's presentation further at this
Sure.
point, but
Sure.
okay.
Director,
Okay.
if I could just, what the December 23 date, just for clarity, is today there's no state regulations for direct potable reuse. There's been a very intensive stakeholder process, and the states indicated that date to promulgate regulations to allow DPR or direct potable reuse.
Isn't San Diego, haven't they implemented it already? Or am I mistaken?
No, they haven't. They're in the process of looking at it.
Oh, they're in
It's
the process of construction.
Well, in parts of it, Larry, they're changing their whole plan. Originally, they were planning to go to that reservoir that's about 30 miles away. Now they're looking at a closer reservoir. And that's what all the activity is about, is they're looking to try to get the water into the closer reservoir, but they have no permit to do so. And I doubt there will be one issued before December of 23.
All right, well, sorry for the distraction.
No,
Just-
it's good comment. Good comment. I just wanted to know what you're thinking. That's all. Now I got it.
Yeah, no, thank you. So just moving, so recycled water notwithstanding, we've tailored our efforts there to the shorter term in terms of the residential fill station and making as much recycled water available for our customers. And then groundwater storage and recovery, just noting how this works, and the board may know, but just for clarity, during wet years, the concept would be to take water from Sonoma and pump it into the Santa Rosa Plain aquifer, for example, during wet years. So when lots of water is available. And then during dry years, that water would be there for us to access. And so again, that's a slightly longer term opportunity and no near term solution for this particular drought.
Do we have an order of magnitude, Paul, on what the range of potential future storage of that nature would be available to us? I know it's not a near-term solution, but
That's a really good question. So I think on the range of 3, maybe to 5,000 acre feet, but that's just a very crude estimate at this time, based on some conversations that I've had with
And
Sonoma.
Paul, is that number for us, or is that the number regionally available that likely others would be interested in as well?
Yeah, good point. So there obviously, we may not be the only ones interested in this option. So whichever agencies were interested in participating in groundwater storage and recovery would then share in that benefit.
So 3 to 5 is the total potential groundwater storage, and then it's divided up by all those that participated in some form or another.
Yeah, if there were other participants, yes. Exactly. And the 3 to 5 really is a very crude estimate based on the fact that the well that they're looking at now is anticipated, when they're hoping to restore that within the year, I think, to start this activity as kind of a trial run. And they're estimating that well would have a capacity of about 800,000 gallons or so a day. And there may be 4 or 5 other spots that they could think about putting wells to that use. So maybe more to come on those details, Director Schmidt.
Okay, so that would be good to understand more about, because I do think there's sort of an emerging opportunity of timing with infrastructure funding and state funding. I know it's a longer term play, but part of what we're trying to address and talk about here today is long-term water supply reliability in dry years. And so it becomes an important piece of that long-term vision, I think.
Agreed. And then just moving along to desalination. Again, we've chatted about this previously, and the timing of our need really dictates a temporary facility, and that results in a limited capacity available. And I'll have a little bit more to say on this in a slide later on. And then, of course, the subject of our presentation, the core subject, the emergency intertie and water transfers today, staff are continuing to pursue feasibility of that project. Noting that we do have a responsibility to continue to look at backup options, water by rail, truck, and barge. And as we continue to refine and understand those numbers better, for example, water by rail does look much less costly than I had presented last time, though I'm not prepared really to share a full analysis on that particular option, but we are continuing to work on all of those options.
So, Paul, I'll let you go through your conservation update. I've got some questions about just our alternatives around conservation, but why don't you keep going? And
yeah, sure. So just quickly to note, enhancing our conservation efforts. So none of these items that we're talking about today do in any way staff consider these fixed or completed items. These are continuing work in progress that we're continuously trying to improve. And conservation being an example of that, where we continue to make progress. We're currently hovering around 30% week-on-week savings from our 3-year baseline. And we're exploring all options to achieve greater conservation and demand reduction. Director Schmidt, did you want to jump in here at this point?
Yeah, I mean, this has bearing on the conversation we're going to go into here in terms of looking at the timing around our decisions to when we need to, make commitments, financial commitments towards a potential pipeline across the bridge. And, right now, probably the only other tool that we have in our immediate term toolbox is conservation, increasing conservation in various different ways. We're setting watering restrictions at higher levels to buy us time, frankly. And so I don't think you probably, as I've kind of mentioned before, and I think obviously there's not time obviously to present it here, but at the next board meeting, it would be really very helpful to look at, what levels of increase required conservation or mandatory conservation would buy us time, given our very aggressive schedule and a lot of decisions that we'll be making right at the start of our next wet season. So maybe we can talk offline, or I've talked with Ben about pulling together some analyses to give us a sense of how much we might buy ourselves in terms of time with increased conservation.
Yeah, we can certainly look at that. Though I would note that, again, and we'll get into the schedule here in a minute, it continues to be very tight. So on desalination, in terms of the temporary, just a few more details. The number of RFPs, as you know, and I had reported previously, were issued. And these three companies, Suez, Osmoflow, and Seven Seas, indicated that they had equipment available that met our needs. Project estimated cost in the range of $30 million. Our schedule still remains about 9 months. Permitting, we think we could get done in 6 months or so, maybe 9 months. It's a complex project, as I've noted before. No one has constructed a desalination plant on San Francisco Bay, but we are well positioned based on our previous studies of desal to be able to answer regulator questions. Equipment and procurement can be done within the 6 to 9 month timeframe. Again, the capacity of 3.6 million gallons per day really doesn't meet our identified need. And so for that reason, our desalination really is we're sort of looking at it as a backup option. It doesn't preclude a long-term desalination alternative, as I've noted here, but additionally, it doesn't mean that we've stopped completely thinking about this as an option for us.
Paul, for the benefit of folks who might not understand how to look at 3.6 million gallons per day, can you put that in terms of dry season water use or something else that folks can understand?
Yeah. So if we were, let's assume we had decided that we were going to be in dire straits, and we really were limiting water use to just wintertime water use, for example, or even perhaps slightly less. Wintertime water use around 15 million gallons a day. So this represents, somewhere around a quarter of that. But hopefully that's helpful. So then we'll move into the intertie update. And this remains our schedule, and the team is working as hard as we can to keep this schedule. Noting that our feasibility analysis is due in September, which we are just about in another day here or so. And that this schedule is really being driven by water supply. This chart indicates our projection for reservoirs, storage levels, should we both achieve a 20 or 40% conservation level as indicated by the gray or red dashed line, and that we receive a similar level of rainfall and runoff as we did last winter. So it indicates a supplemental supply sometime being needed in the second half of next year. Other schedule factors beyond water supply include, this is a complex project. There are multiple agencies, and we'll get into a little bit of that later on, that does increase the complexity in terms of planning and timing and just aligning all of those agency needs. It is a technically challenging project in that we have a couple of unusual facilities that we need to get across. One of which is the Chevron refinery facility, where the pipes go from land to their pier. And I would note that we've had nothing but good support from Chevron to date. The bridge itself is old and of limited capacity. And again, in that area, we're receiving terrific support from Caltrans. We do have materials lead time concerns over pipe. We're going to need somewhere in the region of, I think, 7 to 8 miles or so of 24-inch pipe. In addition, we need a couple of pump stations, each of which will be sort of trailer-mounted pumps. And those can take a considerable amount of time, given there's sort of uncertainty in the supply chain market around little things, air conditioners for container units seem to be challenging for folks to get hold of, and variable frequency drives, which are a component of the pump itself. And then, of course, the motor. So a lot of electrical supply type concerns over the pumps. And we want to get started on some of those should the board decide that we want to move forward. And then a long, complex project, of course, unforeseen issues during construction may pop up. So as we look at our feasibility progress report, on bridge, we've identified a few alternatives, and we've looked at the sort of geometry as to how the pipe might fit in those particular alignments. And so, you know, essentially, structurally, we're at a partially complete point in terms of the on-bridge work. So more to do there. As we approach the bridge from the east side, from Richmond, we've identified 3 possible connection points to the East Bay Mud network, and we've got a viable pipe alignment to the bridge itself. And of course, we've got some details worked out in concept for the pump station, as we've looked at the hydraulic profile for the pipeline, as the water would have to be pumped up to the bridge and then over to the other side. And on the west side in Marin, we've identified a route to the district's facility at Pelican Way, where we might locate a tank and another pump station to distribute that water out to our customers. Overall, the project alignment looks like this. Not surprisingly, it's pretty straightforward when you look at it at this level. But this rather neat graphic belies some of the complexities that we've talked about. On the bridge itself, perhaps the most challenging aspect of the project, we've identified 3 or looked at 3 alternatives at this point. Alternative 1, if the pipe were to be located below the lower deck, so you know, be underneath that lower deck. This option doesn't appear to be feasible, really, due to construction challenges, maintenance issues that you might imagine coming up. It'd be very difficult for access. And of course, in terms of permitting specifically, we're thinking that if we took this route, it does look like the pipe would go below the frame of the bridge. And that would mean we would alter the clearance from sea level to the bridge, which would trigger a Coast Guard review. And Caltrans did indicate that that can be an extremely lengthy and challenging process. So this option has not been carried forward in terms of structural analysis. Alternative 2 is below the upper deck, and this does appear to be feasible. We're still looking at how the bridge and the pipeline will respond in certain sections of the bridge. So there's a little bit more work for us to do in terms of the structural analysis here, but it does look like it should be feasible. Alternative 3, which is in the multi-use or commonly referred to as the bike lane, does appear feasible. And really the biggest concerns here at the moment appear to be that we need to assess how a pipeline might impact the current and future use of that lane.
Paul, a question if I can.
Yeah.
Have we ever considered not going on the bridge, but literally putting it in the bay?
We've looked at that, and we will develop that as a sort of a backup option, but we're kind of concentrating our resources at the moment to you know, these options that appear to be, at least on the face of it, more economically viable for us.
Okay.
Remember too, Jack, that URS did a pretty thorough review of that back when Helliker was the GM. There is a report on that subject of running a pipeline on the bottom.
Okay. Yeah, I'd forgotten that.
In terms of our coordination with key agencies, this is most of them, but I'm sure I may have missed 1 or 2. Just of note, California Department of Transportation, commonly Caltrans, of course, San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. And I'm not going to read all of these out, but you can see there are a variety of permitting or encroachment agency type discussions that we need to have, along with some of our partner discussions with East Bay Mud and Contra Costa for getting the water to us, and then the source of the water transfers themselves, should those pan out and should the board decide to move forward with Glenn-Colusa and Huber Water Agency. And then for the water transfers themselves, a series of permitting depending on that source, ranging, California Department of Water Resources, the USBR, the United States Bureau of Reclamation, the State Water Resources Control Board. And I just want to note here at the end, we've got the Inverness Public Utility District, and then any other West Marin agencies. Those agencies are under some stress at the moment in terms of their water supply. And they have reached out to the district asking, if the project does go forward, would they be able to benefit from the project itself? And that will be the subject, again, of future board discussions. But just to note that here, that there is a larger area at play in terms of water supply. Pivoting then to the project, the team that's guiding us through this this challenging process, the Marin Water team, you, I think, are all familiar with. With Crystal, myself, and serving as project managers during the different phases. And then Mark Casray will be our sort of continuity leader. He'll be the project engineer. Mark is a new addition to the district with a lot of good experience in complex project management and engineering. And of course, we have our operations superintendents assisting us with operations support and design review. On our consulting team, Woodard and Curran are our overall program management and of course, handling water transfers. Corolla Engineers are handling the off-bridge engineering design and analysis, and WSP Global are doing the bridge structural and design analysis for us. Deemer Engineering is playing a crucial role for us, sort of like an independent program advisor almost. And that's proving to be very valuable. And of course, we have a need for environmental support, and that's being filled by ESA, who are under contract with the district. Looking at the first of our feasibility contract amendments in the feasibility phase, we have Woodard and Curran, as I mentioned, program management, but really they're responsible for coordinating and review of all of the consulting teams of work, including some of the technical work, and largely responsible for helping us navigate and develop our water transfers. And of course, last but not least, assisting with the coordination efforts with all of those key agencies that I just mentioned. The level of effort to complete the feasibility and transfers and to review that 30% design of all of the other consulting teams is $727,554. And again, Corolla Engineers, they're handling all of the off-bridge engineering, very typical, and you're probably familiar with many of these terms, but they'll be doing a number of field investigations and survey work to support any potential alignments, of course, developing the design basis, and then, using some of those field investigations, working through permitting and stakeholder engagements. They'll also be preparing any pre-purchase documents and then supporting us in review of submittals and for services during the fabrication of those materials. Corolla's effort is about to complete feasibility and the 30% design is $1,274,466. WSP, who are again doing the bridge analysis work for us, they're helping us understand how the different alignments on the bridge behave in terms of both seismic and structural. And they're going to be responsible for preparing what's called the Advanced Planning Report, which is an essential report for Caltrans to be able to sign off on the project. And that's really our first key step in terms of Caltrans. So until at the conclusion of that step, we'll be ready to present a preferred alternative across the bridge. And at that point, WSP would then be able to identify their scope of work for design. So you'll notice that their scope of work here really is just the advanced planning report. And the level of effort for WSP to complete the advanced planning report is $154,705. And while this may seem somewhat lower than the other amounts, given the complex nature of the work that WSP are doing, WSP were selected precisely because they were extremely familiar with this bridge, not only the bridge, but how Caltrans works. So they've done a good amount of work on this bridge and understand, for example, without really having to do any further analysis, exactly where the weak points are. So they can go straight to some of those sections that they know that are weak and run some calculations and then understand, how they need to make changes, if they need to make changes to any of those sections. In terms of water transfer and wheeling agreements, we are in discussions with Contra Costa, looking at how they might be able to support us for storage of water and helping us with the timing and movement of water. Similarly, with East Bay Mud, we're discussing, how would the water move through Freeport? Would they be able to support short-term storage of water and then water treatment and delivery of that water? And then the two promising sources of water, Glenclusa and Yuba, we're discussing proposing terms for a water transfer option with Glenclusa, and we expect to hear back from them this week on that in terms of a draft. And then Yuba Water, we're discussing a potential transfer of water for Marin sort of through Contra Costa.
Paul, are either East Bay Mud or Contra Costa offering to sell any water, or are they just part of conveyance or storage?
So East Bay Mud really is strictly conveyance, storage, treatment, and delivery through their distribution system at this point. Though, they are a sister agency, and if things got really bad, I'm sure we could use contacts and maybe be the beneficiary of some sort of kindness on their part. But I'm not sure that we could plan on that. If they were in an emergency situation themselves, they might find themselves unable to do that. But typically, water agencies, help each other out whenever they can. As far as Contra Costa goes, it's my understanding that they do have some local water that they're considering making available to us, but only if sort of as a last resort, because that water could also be part of their emergency supply.
And Paul, do we know the status of Antioch's project on the Delta?
We're digging into that, and we'll have a little bit more detail for you. But that project is, I think, under construction, maybe starting, last February or this past February. And it's a 6 million gallon a day desalination facility. So we're going to be talking to them and see if is there expansion potential at that facility? Is there excess capacity available at that facility? What would they be doing with the water that they're currently using? Just really digging into that a little bit more to understand if there's anything there that we could be beneficiary from.
And would an intertie have some sort of network connection to Antioch?
Yeah, that's the idea. Probably through Contra Costa.
Okay.
Paul, can you talk a little bit more about the Central Valley irrigators, Glenclusa and Yuba? I've had a couple of questions from constituents who are having a hard time getting their heads around that farmers would have any water given the cutbacks. And so it'd be great if you could explain, I don't want to derail you, but a little bit more about why those districts may be in a position to be selling water to cities like and municipalities like Marin.
Wouldn't that be a great interview question? Explain water transfers in 100 words or less.
Please do that, yes.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. Glencalusa Irrigation District essentially provides water to rice farmers, right? And these irrigation districts and rice farmers have extremely old water rights that are essentially, they've almost never been curtailed. I think in the worst case, they were curtailed to 25%. But essentially they're almost never curtailed. And it's just a legacy of California's historic, the way water rights are in California. It's sort of if you were the first one to claim the water right, then you have the strongest and almost unassailable rights to that water in California. So both Glencalusa, if they ask their farmers if they're interested in selling water, and if they are, then that's the water that's available for being, to be used by someone like Marin or others for that matter.
Might mention, Paul, that it's pretty well explained on an article on the front page of the IJ today, specific to Glencalusa. Just FYI.
So there is so that article, I thought that was a LA Times article, but I haven't looked at the Marin IJ yet this morning. But if it's there, that's great. That would be a good.
It's on the front page, lower left corner.
Great. Thanks for that. So does that address your question?
Yeah, and I'll just say, as a water rights lawyer, it's very consistent with my experience. It's just counterintuitive to the public. So I just want to make sure that we are explaining that as clearly as possible. I just had a bunch of questions from people over the weekend, and it's just, when you see that there's so little snow in the Sierra and you hear about these cutbacks to farmers, it's very difficult, I think, for the average person who's just looking for water to come out of their tap to really understand that, notwithstanding that, as you've just said, Paul, there are these farmers with older rights, and that it may be in their best interest, financially and otherwise, to be selling water to cities rather than growing rice or alfalfa or whatever it is. So I just appreciate you taking the extra time to lay it out. And I think, first in time, first in right is familiar to those of us in the water industry, but is, again, almost very difficult for people to understand that aren't involved in water day to day. It makes no sense to them. So my approach is usually to just say, yes, it is irrational, and yet that is the status of the law right now.
I think that's the best term for it. Yes, it's not logical and it's not rational. It's just
but
the way it is.
But it is the status of the law right now, which is why,
absolutely.
Which is why they're in a position to do that. So I just want us to be sensitive, both as board and management and staff, to be just aware that the public really needs a lot of education on this, because it's very, very, I think it's challenging for a lot of people and very counterintuitive. So thank you for indulging me there.
Yeah, no, excellent point. So as we look then, get back into our presentation a little bit on key milestones, today being one of them, where we're looking at the feasibility amendments to complete the feasibility work and to conduct up to 30% design, sort of in support of our environmental documentation. And in September, we'll be coming back to the board, right now penciled in September 21st for CEQA, and potentially authorizing full design. Although full design might not begin, the remaining full design after the 30% might not start until, end to middle of October. And then between now and November, we do expect, various transfer and wheeling agreements from Contra Costa, East Bay Mud, Glencalusa, and so on to be brought to the board for consideration. On October 19th, we've penciled in here a pre-purchase of materials. This is the pipelines, the pumps, and certain fittings that we might need to get the pipeline across the bridge. And then finally, if the board chooses to award construction in end of January, beginning of February next year.
Well, are we going to talk about those dates at all? Whether they're, I think
Yeah.
particularly the question of the pre-purchase of materials, whether there's,
Yeah.
I know there's some driving factors behind there. Are we going to talk about that in detail, or would now be the good time?
I think we can try to answer any of those particular questions now, but it may be, September 7th might be a better venue for that at the next board meeting, but I'm happy to entertain any of the questions. I would just say to start with that if we're still targeting July next year, the pump stations themselves will be very challenging to get within that time frame. And so we may be developing, for example, rental options until the permanent pumps can be brought in. So there'll be, it's already a very challenging timeline, is what I'm trying to say, to meet July. So the strategy would be, can we move the July date at all? And that was to some of your earlier questions, Director Schmidt. What are the effects could the effects be of additional drastic conservation measures and that sort of a thing?
I'd like to say one thing, Paul. Monty, I don't think you should think of this of conservation as buying time. It's buying water. That's what it's really aimed at. And the longer we can extend our water supply, the better off we are. The time is just a peripheral benefit potentially of that, but the real issue is saving water.
And if I were to,
I think maybe just one thing at a time. I think that the question I have is just in terms of that contract to acquire pre-purchase materials is really a substantial commitment, and it's sort of it's a bulk of the, well, not the bulk of the cost, but it obviously sets in motion, construction. I know that some of the driving factors behind, as I understand, some of the driving factors behind making that October 19th pre-purchase materials was that manufacturers of pipes tend to shut down in the wintertime for maintenance or whatever. I'm just wondering if we have explored whether there are other manufacturers out there who could be constructing during that time, and if so, does that change that window of time of when we need to pre-purchase materials so that we have, again, more time possibly to hold off on making that commitment and getting us into winter while still maintaining, our current schedule of trying to be completed by sometime in June.
So Paul, if I could, I do very much understand the issue that October 19th does feel like a serious, these are all big decisions, but a very serious commitment in terms of moving forward. And the schedule at this point, October 19th, we're unlikely to benefit from understanding what the winter may bring us in terms of rain, and it feels a bit around the corner, understandably so. So if it works for you, Director Schmidt, we can force the next board meeting, first meeting in September on the 7th, we can dive deep into the schedule and try and bring in all of the questions you've had around that, including the conservation piece, what it would take under different scenarios to push things out, as well as better understanding the nature of what's going on in the fabrication world of pipes and the other equipment that we may need on this time frame. And as Paul indicated, with pumps, there's a potential to rent pumps that could buy time there, and just really lay it all out to the best that we're able to. The drivers and the issues leading to this October 19th date, and what would be different approaches and scenarios and risks, and all, the whole collective of the issues, and work through that at the September meeting, if that works for you.
Yeah, that would work for me. Thank you.
I also think, Ben, we should point out that, this is not like buying a pig in a poke. I mean, I'm trying to find out right now. I was looking to see how much steel cylinder pipe is bought in America in a year. I have to imagine it's 100 times the numbers we're talking about, meaning that it's not a lost cause. If we were to get very fortunate and not need to do this, we could sell the pipe. It's not like we're going to, it's not like it's a throwaway material. So you need to keep that in mind, that it's a commodity that can be sold. The other issue is you mentioned other places that manufacture. One of the things that's coming about with the federal side of this is by American made. So that's the limitation we're facing. Sure, there's lots of places that can make the pipe, but not in America.
Well, thank you. That really helps, I think, to again understand what might be our options as we move forward. If we pre-purchase the material, it would be great to have some kind of an assessment of could we break even? Would there be a 20% loss? What would be our rough cost of sunk cost if we purchase that pipe and we get a very wet year, we refill our reservoirs and we rethink the need for this, we decide to sell these materials, what's going to be the cost? Obviously the design work, that will be done, but that will have value, I think, on into the future. But if we were to decide to hold off on actual construction and we were to sell the materials, what kind of fiscal impact would we consume selling off the materials?
Just to follow up on Monty's question about finances, my question is, would the material purchase be subject to a bidding process? Number one, and number two, I assume a project of this magnitude would require some kind of bond funding, which is not in place. So, another question, another issue is our financial capability of, financing this rather large, probably be the largest infrastructure project we've done ever.
Those are very good points. Our finance director, Chuck, is beginning to look into the pre-work in terms of bonding, and we'll be bringing that information as well based on the question, and we've been developing it anyway at the next board meeting in terms of the timing of the bond and what would that potentially look like. And why don't we, unless Paul, you have an answer for the bidding piece, we could also bring that to the next board meeting of different negotiations, a pure bid process or other potential approaches.
Yeah, no definitive answer at this point. Or just note that our code allows us to seek informal quotes, and if we were doing this project or chose to pursue the project as an emergency, that would provide some other provisions that would allow us to proceed through procurement processes more rapidly, and we can bring those details at another time.
Might indicate too, Larry, that we're only talking about $15 million on this part. I'm trying to get the cost of Alpine Dam. I think that's probably our biggest project that we've done. It was $265,000 in 1917, and looks like that escalates up to about 20 million or something like that today.
I would guess Kent is even bigger. Than that.
Kent, yeah.
But as we're talking about costs, again, our estimates until we get through feasibility remain the same, 60 to 90 million. Annual cost estimates to finance that debt are about range between 2.8 for the 60 to 4.2 for the $90 million cost. And then of course, operational costs when it's in use. The rate impact, again, estimated 3.5% to 5.25%. And of course, noting that there are grants that we've, I think, talked about in previous presentations for immediate drought relief. I think that the state's made available $500 million, and we'll definitely be pursuing grants and whatever other vehicles we can identify that would assist us through the financing of this, should we decide to move forward. Our next steps that
Just for reference, Nicasio Dam in 1956 cost $12,600,000 in 1956.
and so our next steps then remain to press forward with key agency coordinations to make sure they're both familiar and on board with what we think we may need in order to pursue the project. And of course, completing our feasibility analysis remains our number one goal here. For future consideration for the board, these items to think about, notwithstanding the bond funding component, but water transfer agreements will be coming through, wheeling agreements, the sequent design phase authorization, the pre-purchase of materials that we just touched on, and then of course through the to award of construction. While we're doing this, we're continuing to develop our backup options, temporary desalination, water by rail, truck, and barge. And of course, last but definitely not least, conservation. We're continuing to refine and improve and push for greater conservation. So that concludes my presentation this morning. If there are any other questions I can help with. And this was just an
thank you for I just want to thank you for a very comprehensive overview. I think we should put the slides online. I think we should probably do some sort of outreach, Emma, to the community. I think there's been a lot of conversation out there about running out of water, and I think we are at a time where you need to I think be a little bit clearer than we have been, that the district is laser-like focused on this, not this particular not only this particular strategy, but I do think we need to be clear with the public about everything that we are doing and be somewhat, I will just say that for me, listening to this, I have a very high degree of confidence that we are going to get through this. We are not going to run out of water. I find that the conversation in the public is a little schizophrenic. On the one hand, there's an enormous amount of anxiety that we will literally run out of water and water will stop coming out of taps. And at the same time, I'm hearing people saying things like, I really feel like I should have all the water I need to garden however I like. So, I mean, we're either, I think we need to be clearer about what this water is for, that this is for essential purposes. This is for, we're going to be making these investments, not so that, we can be wasting water, we can be consuming water at levels that are unsustainable, but that we are laser-like focused on ensuring that we have sufficient supplies for this community, regardless of how long the drought lasts. So I think Paul, what you've laid out gets us down the road, but I do think that we need to provide, I think, a higher level of assurance than we have been able to date. And that's not a criticism. I know everybody's been working very hard, but there have been a lot of voices that have been not that constructive out there. And we do need to find some ways. I mean, I think providing a level of assurance, I don't think people realize how much work we're doing to address this issues, I guess what I'm saying. And I think what you've laid out here today, Paul, is very reassuring. It is very thoughtful. It's very considerate. It does require funds. It does require quick action, but I think it's impressive, and I think it's comprehensive.
Well said. Any other comments from the board? Any public comments?
Yes, we have several. The first two are Jerry Morel and Mike Napolitano. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, thank you very much, and congratulations to your staff for an outstanding presentation. I'd like to compliment directors, I'll just say Cynthia and Monty on your great op-ed today. It was excellent. I hope that you will proceed very quickly with this pipeline option. I do believe it is the best one. I was able to work on the original pipeline back in 1977 when I worked for the state, and We managed to get that in quickly with great work by your staff at that time. There have been many, many letters to the IJ and others, and even the Light about desalination. And while your staff has pointed out some of the problems, I think the environmental problems with implementing desalination need to be more strongly emphasized. It can be done. San Diego does have an operating desal plant. Huntington Beach may have one someday. It took about 10 years to get that permitted by the Coastal Commission, and that was with an ocean discharge. The idea of discharging brine to San Francisco Bay would be extremely controversial and very tightly regulated by the Regional Water Board, by BCDC, other agencies. And I think people are radically underestimating the ease with which you can actually install a desal plant, let alone the very high energy costs and global warming implications of operating a plant like that. Finally, I'd like to thank your staff and especially Ben for listening to the concerns we have out here in West Marin and the possibility of doing a water exchange and allowing IPUD and perhaps other water agencies out in West Marin to acquire a little bit, teeny bit of the water that you may buy up in the Sacramento Valley and sending it to us by exchange through your Lagunitas Creek supply. That may make a tremendous difference to the viability of living out here in West Marin, and we really appreciate your taking that into consideration. I know you'll be talking about that at a later board meeting. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your comments, Jerry.
Mike Napolitano, and then after him is Mimi Willard and Larry Minikes. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, this is Mike. I work at the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Board, and thank you again. It was a very informative presentation. I really appreciated it. And I just had a couple of quick questions. I'm not an engineer. My background is in geology and hydrology, geomorphology, but I have a question. What would be the pumping capacity through the pipeline? And then the other question I have is, in considering these water transfers, is there a time frame for them? Are these short-term contracts potentially, or would they potentially also be longer-term contracts? Thanks.
Chair Russell, if you okay, I'll answer those.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah. So in terms of capacity, we're thinking, in the region of 13 million gallons per day as a pumping capacity through the pipeline. And then in terms of time frame, right now we're only discussing a short-term transfer for this drought. That's all we're talking about today. This is an emergency project that we're pursuing.
Ms. Willard?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So let's see, I'd like to follow up on that answer that Paul just gave. How short-term is a short-term transfer, given that there's going to be a $60 to $90 million in capital investment? So that's obviously we'd like some clarity on that, and there's also the possibility that this drought is not it turns out to be something that's really long-term. So it would be highly desirable if one were going to make this investment that there are concrete renewal options in place for us to sustain the access to the water that we've invested in trying to tie into. That's not to say we shouldn't do it. I think it's just to suggest that we really should have some clarity on the answers to those questions. With regard to the positioning of the water line, where it would go, I think for the next meeting, it would be very helpful if you would provide information on option 2 versus option 3 in terms of the cost and the timing and the weight issues on the bridge, so that a crisper informed decision could be made. Thirdly, I think it would be prudent to put a reversal of the desal restrictions onto the June ballot. That doesn't commit any of us to liking desal, sight unseen, or the feasibility, but it keeps your options open. And then finally, at your September 7th board meeting, which it sounds like is kind of also going to be a public workshop and informational session, which I think would be outstanding. Please review for everybody who hasn't been watching carefully all the different options that you are looking at or ones that you have rejected and why. And I would suggest in that you also mention dredging, which I've heard some people ask for some information on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead,
Paul,
Ben.
I just wanted to take the short-term versus long-term transfer, but you can add to that whatever. I'd say I just wanted to note that in the time frame we're working, these transfers are kind of by definition one-time transfers. That said, we can't predict the duration of this drought. So we are looking at potentially with the agreements we're going to be bringing to our board, more volume of water than we may need for year one, and working with our sister agencies for potential storage of that water for, maybe a year's time that would allow, if the drought extended. These sorts of transfers are done routinely over approximately, I've heard, 100 a year occur. And there is a measure of confidence that that active market will continue, although certainly at times the price of the water fluctuates based on demand. To get permanent rights, which would be the alternative path, long-term rights to water, that would really be a long-term endeavor. Certainly, it's not necessarily precluded, but this project by design is focused on addressing the emergency situation we're currently in.
We have Larry Minikes, and then after Mr. Minikes is Frank Eggert and Tracy Pettis.
Terry, just a couple more. I think there were a couple more questions that
Sure.
Ms. Willard had. So as far as where the pipeline would go on the bridge, and could we speak to the various merits of one alternative over another? That's sort of the purpose of the advanced planning study. So it'll be a little bit of time before we're really prepared to answer those questions. And then thanks for your other suggestions regarding the ballot. That would be up to the board of directors' discretion. And then, of course, we'll take a look at some of the other options. But we did talk about excavation of reservoirs, which I think is what you were suggesting. And I think at the last meeting, I noted that, to excavate a reservoir to 10,000 acre feet was about 16 million cubic yards of material. And just to compare that to Hoover Dam is only 4.3 million cubic yards of concrete. So, there's a reason why they put dams across valleys to create a reservoir as opposed to digging them from scratch. So dredging is just a very challenging option.
The other thing, Paul, I think you have to point out is that the state board order issued in 1995 says that any additional water we capture, we have to release. So raising the dams, removing the sediment, we cannot store any additional water to what we currently have. We have to just release it all. We can capture it, but we have to then release it to Lagunitas Creek.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Anyway, thanks, Terry.
Mr. Minikes.
Yes, there was an early discussion about what San Diego's doing and their pure water program. And I thought it'd be useful to know that 10 days ago on the 20th, the mayor made an announcement that they have moved ahead with phase 1, which is actually 11 different construction projects. And what they're expecting from this pure water project is that by 2035, 50% of their water will be local water. Currently, they're importing 90% of it. And what they're getting is that it's not inexpensive, but it will really solve their problems. And they've gotten from the EPA a loan for $733 million plus, and then another loan from the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund for $665 million plus $80 million in state and federal grants. And you know, the letter writers are all talking about desal, and no one is looking at recycling our wastewater into a pure water system. I think we really need to take a good close look at what San Diego's doing, because it is really quite interesting and it's very current. And with that, that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. And don't worry, I'm staying right on top of San Diego. I've been in several meetings regarding the San Diego situation, and your assessment is correct. The key point being 2035. They're basically pushing and betting on the state to issue these usable standards for DPR in December of 23. However, they're not really looking at DPR in the classical sense. They're dumping it in a reservoir. And like I say, the original San Vicente Reservoir is the project that I proposed to them back in 20 years ago and has now moved forward. But they're looking at using, I think it's called Porter Reservoir, which is a much closer reservoir in town with a much shorter detention time. The large reservoir has something like, I don't know, 5 years of capacity or something. So it has a lot of dilution, but you're correct. And don't worry, Larry, we are looking hard and heavy at uses for reclaimed water, starting with the effort we made with Las Colinas. That is the best of it right there. Paul indicated what was done, and Larry Bragman correctly described it as an ultrafiltration unit that was put in. But I think the more important part that wasn't discussed is that we used to put the water into a reservoir. It looks like a duck pond out there. And it used to have horrendous algae growth problems. And basically the new system sucks the water right out of the effluent and is set up to use all the water that can be produced by Las Colinas to be reclaimed completely. And that's the real difference in the two water qualities that have, there's a tremendous step forward by sucking the water out of the effluent pumping station, as opposed to letting it go in, pumping it into the reservoir and then retrieving it back. 80% of our effort in our treatment plant that was put in as one of the first plants in the world in the 80s was to remove the algae, which was a horrendously difficult task. So we are looking at it, and we got a lot of plans on the board for moving forward with reclaiming the water.
Mr. Egger?
Thank you. Frank Egger, Fairfax. An intertie on the Richmond-Santa Fe Bridge allows water to travel in both directions. Water from the overdrafted Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta being sent to Marin, and water from Marin and the Russian Eel River complex being sent to Contra Costa County. Chinook salmon in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta are teetering on extinction. Why does Marin want to quicken the demise of Chinook salmon? The state has allowed the sale of paper water for decades. There is no surplus water in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta. The proposed intertie will facilitate 14,000 new living units in Marin and 17,000 new units in Sonoma from 2023 to 2031. Next, the state will require an additional 31,000 units in Marin and Sonoma for the 2032 to 2040 cycle. Where's the water for 62,000 new units coming from by 2040? The proposed pipeline will give you 13,000 gallons per day. CMSA, Central Marin Sanitation Agency, collects, treats, and discharges 12 million gallons a day into the San Francisco Bay, actually San Pablo Bay. If our current usage here in Marin is at 124 gallons per person per day, and if that is cut to 37 gallons per day per person, how much water will that save? It was mentioned earlier that there is too much salt in the CMSA wastewater. Ross Valley Sanitary District has stopped a lot of saltwater intrusion with new pipes and pumps. Before Marin Water discards the option of a reverse osmosis system at CMSA, Marin needs to see a current report on the salinity content. Lastly, since an environmental impact report is required under the California Environmental Quality Act, I notice you have September 21st for CEQA approval. So when will the actual scoping session start? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.
After Tracy Pettis, we have Roger Roberts, then Barbara Salzman. Go ahead, Ms. Pettis.
Hello. I just really have been educated this morning. I'm new at listening to board meetings, and I just hope this recording is available to the general public, so we'll find out where that is. I agree with Cynthia about her need to increase outreach and awareness, because I've heard the same thing. Some people are caring, and some people, you know, say their water bill went down because they conserve, so now they can use more water. So coming from an advertising background, I have thought about we need some kind of outreach campaign, and I would volunteer my services if this was of interest. That's about all I have to say.
Thank you
I
for
would
your
just like
offer.
to say that we should follow up on that. Thank you for the offer. And Emma, if you could follow up with, I didn't catch her name, Laura. I think that would be fantastic. We certainly need all the support we can get.
Mr. Roberts.
Good morning. This has been the most informative meeting that I've sat in on these issues since this whole issue arose. And what I learned today somehow needs to be transmitted to the public at large. You really need to be able to tell the people what all the alternatives are, what their costs are, what the timelines are associated with the alternatives, so that people can really understand why you're doing what you're doing, which makes perfect sense. And so I would just urge you to take the time with your public outreach to really expand, if you will, the information flow, because there's an enormous amount of ignorance out there, and it's just an ignorance because people don't have the information at hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Salzman, and then after Ms. Salzman is Mr. Mark Milan.
Hi, I'm Barbara Salzman, and yeah, I'd like to express my personal concern about rushing ahead, or maybe it's not rushing, but it feels like it to me, onto the bandwagon for desal, not for desal, for the pipe over the bridge. You know, just because we have a sick system in water rights system in California to allow people to move water around doesn't mean we should be part of it. And that we've been one of the, maybe the only a water district in the state that kind of depends on our own resources. And it troubles me that we would join a system that has, unless it's really, really temporary, it troubles me that we would join a system that really has destroyed and is continuing to destroy the San Francisco estuary system. I would urge you to put a lot more effort into the Las Colinas plant, as Larry Bragman brought up. I think that seems to have great promise. And I would also like to say that, as you have heard from me recently, I think we really need to shore up our conservation efforts. When we're going to go join a system that is destroying the San Francisco estuary and that is contributing to the extinction of a number of species, so people can build their swimming pools and you know, this is as the public doesn't know, this was a situation on my street, and I didn't say that 2 weeks before that there was a house that was totally destroying their vegetation and planting new non-water conservation vegetation. So if we can't allow this sort of thing to go on, and we should be installing systems like I'm pleased that we're doing the reclamation plan. I think that's a really good step. But we also should consider having all of our customers have a system that will identify their leaks immediately to you and to them, not just to those who want to put the money into having that system. They should all be required to do it. So anyway, that's my personal view, and I hope you pursue Las Colinas more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Just
To
a-
my recollection, we are already using 100% of the Las Colinas flow between us and Novato.
And just a quick response, because I feel like I need to agree with Barbara that certainly taking water out of the Central Valley systems has been detrimental to the state in many ways. At the same time, and I also agree that any kind of movement forward on the bridge pipeline, as we've been discussing today, at least for me, and I think for actually the rest of us, has to be tied to significantly increased demand reduction on a permanent scale. That's really the only justification. That's really the only rationale that I think makes sense. I think Barbara makes a strong point that we can't be making that kind of investment, to, be watering plants that belong in, a water-rich state or, filling pools. It really has to be for essential needs. That said, if we do need water, if the local supplies are not sufficient to meet those essential needs, I do think we need to look beyond. So that's the balance that I'm encouraging board and management to be making.
And our last speaker is Mark Milan.
Thank you very much. I'm Mark Milan with Data Instincts. I actually am assisting Emma and Carrie with outreach for the district. And I also happen to serve on the Water Reuse California Board of Trustees on water reuse. I worked on the DPR initiative over the years for the state of California. I wanted to mention a couple things. One is that my observation of how the district is doing for conservation is very good. It's obviously important to maximize water conservation and to also maximize your use of recycled water for potable offsets. And I think the district is really doing a great job of that. In addition, Marin Water is a member of the North Bay Water Reuse Association, and that body and board has been looking at what could be done regionally for indirect potable reuse. And indirect potable reuse is using recycled water to augment either surface water sources or for recharging groundwater. And in this fall, I know that the board is going to be presented with options to look at initial feasibility studies of IPR in the region, which may be beneficial. And that also, if that proceeds, would be sharing the cost of looking at what else can be done with recycled water in the region. So I think that's very positive. I think that General Manager Hornstein and Chair Russell have characterized the IPR and DPR use in the state very accurately. I will say that in the Bay Area, there are projects that have moved forward, like Pure Water Monterey is already operational, and they are injecting into the groundwater. And also just north of them in Santa Cruz area, the Pure Water SoCal project is under construction. And I'm happy to say they received over $50 million in grants from the state, and also 36 million in low interest loans. So there is support. It's accurate to say that the state is very supportive of these projects. And as Paul mentioned, especially during the drought conditions. So I think you're well poised to move forward with the things under consideration today. And I just wanted to share those thoughts for today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Chair Russell, we do have one more speaker.
Okay.
Last person, 8800 phone number. Go ahead.
Oh,
hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is Nancy Okada, and I'm just not to be a broken record, but I think it would really help if the general manager put in his report at every board meeting, and even now, how many new hookups are being required or being applied for, how many new hookups have been done, and the public really needs to know that, and we don't know that, and the board is unwilling to put a moratorium on new hookups. So I think it just, the public needs to know how many more new customers are going online that they're sharing their water with as they cut to hopefully a 40%. So sorry to be a broken record, but I know that Cynthia had said that the general manager was going to send that to Mr. Egger, but my understanding is he hasn't received that information, and that information is not available anywhere in your documents. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are no further speakers.
Okay. Thank you, Nancy. Okay, Ben, you're looking for approval here, or this is to be sent to the board for the consent calendar?
This was an update on the project. The next item is an approval item.
Okay, item 4.
Item 3.
And 3.
Item 3.
3, sorry.
So Paul can, if the board has no further comments on this, Paul can introduce item. They're linked. That item is bringing the contracts that Paul reviewed during this item.
Okay.
Great. So item 3. So as we just discussed, the emergency intertie project is at the point where we're partially through a feasibility analysis as to whether the pipeline can be brought across the bridge. And in order to complete that feasibility analysis, we're looking for the board to authorize the general manager to negotiate and execute amendments to consulting agreements to allow us to complete that feasibility and to go up to 30% design in order to support environmental documentation for CEQA and NEPA as needed. So I guess if there are any questions about that, we could jump into those now.
So these are the costs to get to 30%?
Yes. With the exception, as I noted, I think of the WSP contract, where they're just, that cost is to get us through the advanced planning study. And then once we have the alternative, the alignment across the bridge, then we can jump into the detailed design for that.
Yeah, the only comment I would have, Paul, is I think it's a little unfair to say if the line can be run across the bridge. I mean, it's been run across the bridge before, so obviously the bridge is able to deal with the load. Didn't have any damage that I'm aware of. So, you know, I think it's better to put it how it can be designed to go across instead of if it can be put across. Any comments from the board?
I've got a comment, Chair.
Sure, go ahead.
I don't think this should be approved at a committee meeting. This is an ethical decision that we're undertaking, and following on the heels of our conversation at our last meeting about taking these decisions during formal board meetings, I think is a pretty good guide to how we should deal with this today. We actually have another very important item after this, which is the TUCP item.
Yes.
But what I would propose, I'm not prepared to make a decision to go forward on this today. With all due respect to the work and due diligence that's been done, that is unassailable. But as far as process is concerned, I think this should be put over until our next board meeting. It's 8 days away. It's going to tee it up for a much broader public discussion. There are some other issues that, we should be considering about water quality, about the length of any water contracts that we get into. So, my one, I suppose, exception would be on the WSP piece of it, on the structural viability, which seems there's at least 25 work days that are needed to get that done. Perhaps that should be given a little more priority today. It's the smallest contract, but as far as approving feasibility for 30% design, my position is that it should wait until our board meeting next week.
I like that thinking. What's your thought, Ben?
My thought is I appreciate the sentiments. I think the delay is probably more, and maybe I would let Paul, and if he asks Zav to support him, it's probably more than the 8 days, in that there's a tremendous amount of work going on now. And to stop all of that, negotiations with developing water transfers, weekly meetings with Caltrans, and the list really goes on and on. There's, I don't know, a dozen meetings a week with the consultants and working through. I believe the impact would be significantly more than the 8 days. And the intent of this near-term effort is to really refine the concept of the project so we can bring back more detailed costs to the board. We can bring back details on the impacts. We can understand the details of the transfers to address some of the comments that have come up. So I do understand. I think we've been very clear with the public for a couple of months now of this decision-making today. So I don't think, and I haven't heard public comments suggest that this is some sort of surprise to them. So I think the public did understand, even that the IJ picked up with the article yesterday. So I'm, you know, of course, it's the board's decision, but I would urge the board to move forward with this step that would allow us all to better understand the project in front of us and be able to make the, you know, bigger, more difficult decisions coming up that are with the best information possible.
So I have a comment. My inclination is to agree with Larry Bragman about wanting to make these decisions at the regular board meetings. However, I'm very persuaded by the presentation that Paul made today, by your comments, Ben. This is not a go, no go decision. This is a let's get more information decision. So for that reason, I feel that particularly given the parameters we've laid out about when there should be exceptions to making board decisions in committee meetings, that this fits squarely into them. We just heard that this schedule is already very tight. And again, we're not making an irrevocable commitment to the project. We are making a commitment to getting ourselves and the public informed. And so I will move to approve the contract.
Okay, I will second that. Given actually what Cynthia was saying earlier about the message that people are getting that we're going to run out of water, I think to at this point, in the face of the time schedule that we were just presented with and the challenges that we've been exposed to time-wise of meeting all of this, that if we show signs of sitting back and this isn't all that important, totally the wrong signal. I think we have to move forward, quite frankly.
I'll just weigh in too on this. I too am very concerned about the sequence of decisions and making sure we're making the most cost-effective and fiscally responsible decision. That being said, if we are going to continue to be prepared to ensure that we've got sufficient water supply in the coming year, this seems like a pacing item and a no regrets, because frankly, this is a solution that I think that we may look to, if not now, at some later point in time. So I think it's a good investment and something we need to move forward with at this point, knowing that there are other decisions that we'll make down the road that continue to really lock us in on this as a solution set.
Okay, we have public comment on this.
Yeah, we have 3 public comments. The first one, Mimi Willard, Larry Minikes, and then the last 4 digits, 7713. Go ahead, Ms. Willard.
Yes, I want to remind you that you have a Brown Act problem, which the Coalition of Sensible Taxpayers has notified you of repeatedly through our attorney. And the action that you take today is very possibly in violation of the Brown Act, notwithstanding that you have put at the top of your agenda for the committee meeting 3 words / board of directors. If you look on your own website and the way that your agendas are presented, this is a committee meeting. And so I think that you need to do things in the proper legal way. Your other option, which I think is less desirable, but if you don't want to wait 8 days until the next board meeting, you should properly notice a special meeting that will be devoted specifically to this topic. I happen to agree with Director Bragman that this is potentially an ethical decision and that it should in fact be done at the next board meeting, because that's when you're prepared to look at this decision within the context of the other options. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Minikis?
I tend to agree with both GM Hornstein and Cynthia Kohler on this, and that under Resolution 8630, you have an emergency situation here, and this is called an emergency intertie project. And you have to step into this properly, not agendize this as if this is something we're looking at for the future. You have something going on here that is dynamic, as Ben said. If you stop now, everything comes to kind of a halt, and you really can't afford to do that. The public has been well noticed on the operations meetings and everything that's going on, and anyone that wants to be involved in this can be involved in this. We get complaints that the meetings are held at night and they can't attend them. You get complaints that they're in the day. You get complaints that these are special. No matter how you do it, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, and you really need to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah. The last 4 digits, 8800, please.
Hi, Nancy Okada again. It seems to me, I agree with Director Bragman that this should be held over until the board meeting, because the public really does need to see it in public, and it should be properly noticed in the Brown Act, and I agree with all that as well. One additional thing is, since apparently the water is going to also, this is going to finance Point Melotti's development over there, you might talk to East Bay Mud about getting some money before you approve this to see if you can get some additional financing. But this really needs to go to the board, and you have the votes, but you should wait until the board meeting just for the public, how it looks to the public, especially since we're continuing to add more people on with new water hookups. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
No more.
Okay. Molly, you have any thoughts on this issue?
Thank you very much, Chair Russell. I want to point out that we are being compliant with the Brown Act. It was noticed as a special board meeting. Our board policy, which we just recently discussed, we talked about this very issue of urgency. And I think we all have heard to date just how urgent this project is. And I also want to point out that these contracts are for purposes of feasibility analysis and also to prepare us to do CEQA review. So this is all preliminary work that needs to be done as quickly as possible so that the board is best positioned to consider all the information when it's needing to make those decisions. So thank you for the opportunity to speak on that.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I think it's time to call for a vote.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the motion though?
Cynthia made the motion to
approve the contract as.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Director
Seconded by
Bragman?
Jack.
No.
Director Gibson?
Yes.
Director excuse me, Director Kohler,
Aye.
Director Schmidt,
Aye.
and Chair Russell.
Aye. What I would like to do, Ben, is to schedule this for the board meeting also on the 7th, to have a review of where we are on these issues. Not for a vote, but just for discussion with the public. So we satisfy both ends. We get the doc meeting and then we get the board meeting and have the discussion.
Okay, we'll do that.
I really support that, Chair Russell. I think that's a good idea. I'm just going to note for the staff and the public that are here that I will unfortunately have to miss that meeting. I won't be able to participate even remotely because I will be I will be hiking in Romania. So I'm sorry to miss that meeting, but I'm glad that you will be going forward with it. I think that's very, very sound.
Take lots of garlic so the werewolves don't get you, okay?
Yes, I've been so advised.
Okay, cool. We cool with that, Ben? Ben?
Yes, Chair Russell, we'll do that.
Okay, great. Okay, item 4. I tried to get to this before, but I'm pushed back. So now we have the temporary urgency change petition.
Good afternoon, directors. Oh, go ahead, Alicia.
Good morning, directors. My name is Alicia Irish. I'm an engineering manager in the planning department. We're here today to discuss approval to submit a temporary urgency change petition to the State Water Board for Lagunitas Creek stream flow releases. And before I get started today, I also want to introduce Andy Collison, who is calling in the last 4 digits, 8671. He is our consultant that we've been working with ESA, and he'll be participating in the presentation that I have prepared today. So with that, I'll.
Good morning, board members.
Good morning, thank you.
Are you seeing the display settings?
We are seeing both.
Yeah, you have to click on display settings.
Okay, better?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Well, good morning. Today we're here at the Operations Committee on August 30th. And like I mentioned, we'll be talking about the stream release flow study that we've been conducting, as well as the temporary urgency change petition that we've been doing this in light of. Our agenda today will be a review of our current water supply. We'll then be talking about the Lagunitas Creek itself and a review of Water Board Order 9517. And then I'll pass the presentation over to Andy, who will talk about the results of our flow release study. And we'll also address our draft monitoring plan, our stakeholder outreach, and our proposed temporary urgency change petition recommendation. So just to give a brief review of our water supply, these are some slides that were presented to the board at the board meeting, the last board meeting. You can see here our current water supply for the water year 21-22. As of August 26th, we had just over 30,000 acre feet, which is 38% of our current capacity, or 51% of average for the state. And that storage includes water from our 7 reservoirs. You can see how this compares to other years. Last year, our average, as well as the 2 drought years, 91 and 76, 77. We project this out, projecting both our forecasted winter as well as conservation savings. You can see, like Paul mentioned in his previous presentation, that we are projected to get below 10,000 acre feet, potentially with a 25% average rain and lower conservation by next fall. With 40% conservation savings and a 50% average rain, which is the kind of winter that we've experienced the past 2 winters, we will still be below 30,000 acre feet come 1 year from now. So just to give a brief overview of Lagunitas Creek, which is where the stream flow releases that take place are. Lagunitas Creek is shown in this figure, and it protects the 3 listed species, the coho salmon, the steelhead, and the California freshwater shrimp. And the flow release study that we'll be going into more in depth on in future slides is really done in light to protect these species and to not bring any unreasonable effects to these species. The Water Board Order 9517 is something that we are subjected to as a water district. And amongst many other stipulations, we have in-stream flow requirements that we need to meet along Lagunitas Creek. And these in-stream flow requirements are measured from a USGS gauge at Samuel P. Taylor State Park, which is 3 miles downstream of Kent Lake. These flow requirements are a combination of rainfall, runoff, and MMWD releases from Kent Lake. And you can see in the figure that there are 2 different classifications. There's both a normal year and a dry year. And a dry year is calculated based off of 2 measurements, one on April 1st and the other on January 1st of each year. And what they do is they measure the previous rainfall that's taken place either within the previous 6 months or the previous 15 months. We are currently in a dry year, and this was determined based off of these measurements. And due to the time of year that we are in, we are currently operating under the 6 CFS flow requirement because we are in, it's late August, early September. So the period of flow requirements that we'll be talking about during our flow release study are really the big block that takes place during the November to April timeframe. And now I'll be passing off the presentation to Andy to go into our in-stream flow study findings. Andy?
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, members of the board. So the purpose of the in-stream flow study is to relate the quality and quantity of habitat in Lagunitas Creek to flow releases out of Kent Lake so that we can identify other ways of reducing flow that would not cause an unreasonable effect on habitat. So the study that we've done, I'm hearing feedback, and are other people hearing feedback, or is that just me?
You're okay.
Okay, I'm going to keep going in that case. So the study that we've done is based on a series of test sites that we've set up on Lagunitas Creek. These test sites collectively represent 25% of all of the coho spawning habitat on the river. So we're using these test sites as sort of a sample to analyze flow reductions and then identify what effect that has on spawning quality. So the next slide kind of gets into that in more detail. So we're proposing 2 changes to the water rights 9517 flow release schedule. The first of those changes is to delay the onset of winter base flow. So as Alicia said, in November of a normal year, the district would increase your flow releases from 6 CFS up to 20 CFS. The timing of that is dependent on there being a natural flow event sometime between November 1st and November 15th. And at that point, base flow would be increased and a series of migration pulses would be released to encourage and facilitate coho and steelhead to move up into the watershed. The proposal is to delay that trigger period from November 1st through 15th to December 1st through 15th. So to have a 1-month delay and then release and hold back 1 month's worth of water effectively between summer base flow and winter base flow. However, we want to do that in a way that's protective if we do get fish coming in between November 1 and December 1. So there'll also be an adaptive management component to this, which is shown by that yellow bar, where if there is a natural flow within the watershed, an unregulated flow that would be likely to trigger migration, then district staff will go out, look for fish in the creek, and they'll also increase flow releases to 10 CFS to make sure that any potential spawning grounds are covered by water in that initial period while they're evaluating whether salmon migration has occurred or not. If no salmon have been observed spawning within a week, then flows would be dropped back to the summer base flow until December 1st. So this is a sort of protective measure to make sure that fish don't come in early and spawn and then not have sufficient water. Once we got into December 1st, there would be this 15-day period of waiting for a natural flow event to occur in the watershed. And if no natural large flow has occurred, then the district would increase flows anyway on December 15th, and then go up to the winter base flow. So that's the delay scenario. There are two rationales for this delay scenario, which are shown on the next two slides. So just to explain this slide a little bit, this slide shows the date at which we get the first natural flow out of the watershed, which is big enough to trigger coho migration and steelhead migration up into the system. The fish are generally triggered by a flow that exceeds about 25 CFS. So what we've got on this graph is we're looking at the date that such a flow occurs for the first time in any given year. And you can see on this graph, essentially the effects of climate change. You can see that back in the 1980s, that first flush from the watershed was typically occurring in November. But in the last 10 years, those first flushes have been occurring more typically in December. So essentially the watershed is delaying, or the onset of flow from the watershed is being delayed. And this is something we see throughout California. So the rationale for delaying that transition is it's to hold water back at a time when it is less likely to be used by the fish and reserve that water for when it's more likely to be used by fish that are actually migrating and present. So that's the first line of argument. The second line, probably more importantly, is to say, what are the fish actually doing during that period? So this left-hand graph shows data on coho migration into Lagunitas Creek. So each of these lines represents a different year, the cohort for a different year. And you can see cumulatively on the y-axis the number of fish that have migrated up into the system, and then on the x-axis the date on which they've migrated. And you can see that the current November window for triggering migration typically doesn't cause fish to come in. So the fish are actually not taking advantage of the water that's being released in November. They are moving in really from sort of the end of November or the beginning of December onwards. That's when you see the curves rising and the fish moving in large numbers. And the right-hand plot shows how that translates into coho spawning. So again, you can see there's not a lot of coho spawning happening in November, even though the water is being made available, but they are coming in December when the watershed's natural flow releases are triggering migration. So the rationale for delaying is to hold that water back for when the fish are actually there to take advantage of it, with that protective measure of an adaptive management and monitoring period in case they do happen to come in early this year. So that leads to the conclusion and the recommendation to delay winter base flow by 1 month. The next portion of this is to look at what that winter base flow should be. So the way we evaluated this was to develop habitat suitability models, which are numerical models of coho and steelhead habitat, and then run different volumes of flow out of Kent Lake through those models and look at what effect different flow levels had on habitat suitability. And the next slide basically steps through that process. So if we kind of go from the top left-hand corner, sort of along the bottom and then back up to the right-hand corner here of this graphic, these are the steps that we've gone through in our study. So we start out by identifying, with a lot of input from the Technical Advisory Committee and the resource agencies, we identified 4 reaches of the river to study in very great detail and to set up surveys of those reaches. We then use those surveys in step 1 to create hydrodynamic models, which are models that predict velocity and depth in very great detail in response to different flow levels. Then in step 2, the data from that model goes into habitat suitability curves, which describe how the type of water that coho and steelhead prefer to spawn in and to rear in. So they relate the velocity and depth of the water to how desirable that quality is and how much fish will favor it. And then by combining those 2 sets of data on top of each other, we get maps showing the area of low and high suitable habitat for the different life stages that the coho and steelhead go through. And we're able to translate that in step 4 into metrics where we can see for a given flow release out of Kent Lake, how much area of different quality of habitat do you get? And then we can then compare that with the number of fish in the system and make an evaluation about how much area is needed to support the number of fish that might typically be in the system. So those are the steps we've gone through. And the next couple of slides show you some output from that. This shows you the 4 sites that we surveyed. They collectively make up about a quarter of the spawning habitat in the main stem of Lagunitas Creek. We selected these sites with a lot of input from TAC members and from resource agencies, and then developed these extremely detailed topographic and bathymetric maps that you see in the center of the slide. That's then used to set up these hydrodynamic models, which are on the next slide. And so this shows just one of the sites as an example. This is a site near Irving Road Bridge, downstream of Shafter Bridge. And what we're doing here is running 3 different flows initially, 20 CFS, which is the dry year recommended flow out of the water rights, out of WI 9517. We then ran 15 CFS and 10 CFS to sort of bookend the range of flows that might be feasible, and then understand in more detail where we could look for habitat suitability trends. As you can see, there's not a huge difference in the flow patterns from this, but we do get some sort of subtle changes that can affect habitat suitability. So then next slide. So let's get into the results of that. So for each, what we've done is run this model for coho and steelhead, and we've run it for their spawning stage. We've run it for their fry emergence, and we've run it for the rearing of juvenile coho and steelhead that spawned this year and that will be in the system next year, so 1 year plus. This is an example for coho spawning, which many people have identified as the critical limiting stage in the system. So what we have on this output is we have our 4 different test sites, and we have 3 different flow rates, and it's a little hard to see. It's maybe a little easier to see in the PDF that I think we've provided for this, but as you reduce the flow, you get a reduction in the area of suitable habitat. But you can also see that you do not completely lose suitable habitat. All of the spawning areas that currently support spawning continue to support it, but in smaller areas. This is captured in the next slide, which shows the output. And this is probably the single most important slide in my portion of this presentation. So let me just step through this a little bit. The figure on the left-hand side shows the area of habitat of different levels of quality for coho spawning across all of those 4 sites. So on the x-axis, we've got different amounts of water being released out of Kent Lake from 20 CFS all the way down to 10 CFS. On the left-hand y-axis, we've got the area of the bed of the stream that meets different levels of suitability for coho spawning. So the dark green is highly suitable habitat. The light green is habitat that's usable but less desirable by the fish. The right-hand y-axis, we've translated that into the area, we've divided it by the typical area used by a salmon to spawn. So we've translated it basically into the capacity or the space available for coho and salmon and steelhead rather to spawn in this area. So it's kind of a rough translation from area into numbers of fish. And then the final part of this is the red dashed area. That is the range of coho reds that have actually been observed being laid in the river over the last 4 years. So it gives an upper and a lower band for the number of coho reds that have actually been produced within these parts of the river. So we can compare, if you like, available habitat with sort of demand for that habitat. So what we can see on the top right-hand side, we've translated the different flow rates into the number of reds that would be supported, the number of nests for producing more eggs that would be created. And you can see that for coho, if we go from 20 to 16 CFS, there's about a 17% reduction in the total number of reds that can be produced. You can also see by comparing the highlighted numbers, by comparing the 59 total equivalent reds with the 35 to 9 reds in the bottom right-hand corner, you can compare space for spawning with the amount of space that was used for spawning and see that if we go down to 16 CFS, there should still be sufficient space for the cohorts of coho that we've had over the last few years to spawn, albeit recognizing that fish are unpredictable and that there are many other things that determine where they organize themselves and arrange themselves when they spawn. But in theory, we can see that 16 CFS, yeah.
Excuse me. This is Larry Russell. I'm chairing the meeting, but I'm going to have to hand the meeting off to you, Monty. I have an 11:30 hard call. It's 11:28. So I'm going to continue to monitor what's being said, but I can't run the meeting after this point. So Monty, can you take over?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Will. So yeah, so the upshot of this slide then is that if flows from Kent Lake are reduced from 20 CFS to 16 CFS, there is expected to be a reduction in the quality and quantity of spawning habitat, but it's also expected to be within a limit that would support the typical kinds of numbers of reds that have been seen in the river over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. And the reason we only go back that many years is because if we go back further, the stream bed conditions will have changed. So this gives us some confidence that 16 CFS could be, while it would have some effect, we consider it a reasonable effect on spawning habitat. The next slide shows the same. I'm not going to go through this in the same level of detail, but this is the same set of results for steelhead spawning. So again, we can see that there's a reduction in the number of spawning reds that could be supported if we go from 20 to 16 CFS, and obviously a bigger reduction if we went down further. But the area of suitable habitat is in line with the numbers that we've seen coming back in several of the most recent years. We've also done this for all of the other life stages. So this is for, on the bottom left-hand side, we can see coho and steelhead spawning fry. And actually the area of suitable habitat for that life stage potentially increases because they like shallow, slow-moving water, and there would be slightly more of that if we were to reduce flows from Kent Lake. Coho juveniles and steelhead juveniles, excuse me, we see coho juveniles, the relationship is relatively flat, so they're fairly resilient to the kinds of check flow reductions being proposed. Steelhead rearing is a little bit, it's more of a steep curve, so they're a little bit more affected by it. But the percentage changes for these are all less than the change for coho spawning. Coho spawning at 17% reduction is the most sensitive life stage that we've seen. So the final slide, I think, summarizes all of that. So the first thing to say is it's a complicated pattern. There isn't an obvious bright line where we can say if you reduce flow below this amount, you will have a very large effect. If you don't release it below that amount, there will be very little impact. It's a fairly linear relationship, which means that we're having to make decisions based on a sort of gradual progression from better habitat to less desirable habitat. But there are several converging lines of evidence that make us feel that 16 CFS is a reasonable number to get to. It's one that still leaves quite a large area of habitat available for spawning and rearing and fry emergence. Something that's been raised by some stakeholders as a worry is the risk of dewatering the channel, having the channel completely dry out if we release less water from Kent Lake. That's very unlikely to happen. What we see is that as you release flows from 20 to 16 CFS, there's only about a 4% reduction in the area of the channel that is wetted. So I think, and those are areas that are not typically used by coho or steelhead to spawn. It's very much the marginal fringes of the river. If we look at the other life stages, we see that there's the 17% predicted reduction in coho habitat, a 12% reduction in suitable spawning area for steelhead, and then a reduction in suitable area for rearing of as much as 28% an increase of 28% for coho fry. So the biggest impact again is this 17% reduction in total red area for coho. So in summary, what we're proposing then is a reduction in the winter base flow from 20 to 16 CFS as part of the temporary urgency change petition. And I have one final slide because as Alicia showed at the beginning, we've been very focused on coho and steelhead, but there's a third species which is listed in this system, and that's freshwater shrimp. Freshwater shrimp, their habitat needs are very different. They live in very slow-moving pools, and they're not expected to be affected by the proposed flow reductions. To put this in context, the proposed flow reduction of 16 CFS represents slightly less than a 1-inch reduction in the water level in Lagunitas Creek on average. And so the pools that they live in, since they're typically in about 3-foot deep pools, lowering those pools by 1 inch is not expected to have an effect on them and degrade their habitat. So that's the summary of the interim flow study.
Thank you, Andy.
And with that, I'll hand back.
So now I would like to go into our adaptive management and monitoring program that we've developed in concert with this recommendation. You can see in this table that we've developed a robust monitoring program with that takes into account monitoring activities that we currently conduct, as well as new monitoring activities shown in green that are associated with the TUCP management. And these take place anywhere from weekly to continuous data management to bi-weekly or as conditions allow. And they take place in locations starting from Peters Dam all the way down into lower Lagunitas Creek towards Gallagher Ranch. Our adaptive management approach would take into account this monitoring that we would be conducting during the TUCP period from November to April to inform adaptive actions. And then if we were to observe effects that warranted further discussion, there would be a multi-step process to inform these adaptive management actions. And they would be in a stepwise process, starting with increased biological and hydrological monitoring. And we would then consult with our agencies, the resource agencies, to inform adjustments to flow releases. And then finally, step 3 would be to adapt our operations and to continue with our increased level of monitoring. We also have very frequent reporting in that we will be meeting and reporting weekly to the resource agencies, as well as performing monthly reporting to the Lagunitas Creek Tax Subcommittee regarding our monitoring findings and any operational responses that may have taken place. To go through this flow study process, we've been having regular and common engagement with our stakeholders, both with the Lagunitas Creek TAC, as well as our resource agency meetings. So we've been meeting with the resource agencies monthly, both as a group, as well as individually, as well as meeting with the Lagunitas Creek Subcommittee monthly between May through August. We've also given updates at the Lagunitas Creek TAC as a body as a whole, and we met with the State Water Board on 2 separate occasions, both in May and in August. Throughout this process, we've gotten several comments, both from the resource agencies as well as the TAC subcommittee. And we've been very diligent in integrating those comments into our flow study. This started with concern about the limited area of the habitat studied, and we subsequently expanded the length of those reaches, as well as brought stakeholder participation into that location selection. There was also concern about temperature monitoring and a temperature trigger, which we have then included into our monitoring plan. And we also received feedback about the rainy season occurring later than it has been in the 1990s, which actually prompted our analysis to delay our winter-based flow. And then finally, back in our last meetings with the agencies, there was some concerns about the 14 CFS winter-based flow, as well as requests for more frequent monitoring. And we've since increased our recommendation to a proposed 16 CFS base flow, and increase from bi-weekly to weekly reporting. Since August 13th, we have put out our final draft of our TUCP monitoring plan to both the resource agencies and the tax subcommittee for review. We've gone over comments that we've received and conducted final agency meetings to review those modifications and receive final comments. And last week, our marine water fisheries staff had a technical review with the agencies to go over the most updated monitoring plan, which is what we presented to you today. So finally, during our meetings with our stakeholders, there was some comments about or concerns about what we are proposing to save through the TUCP versus what we are saving through our community water conservation. And so Our community water conservation is more of a long-term savings in that we're looking for a 15 to 20% annual conservation from our 3-year average base flow of approximately 26,000 acre feet. And this will give us a projected annual savings of 3,900 to 6,500 acre feet. The TUCP proposal savings is a one-time savings. And with the proposed delay to the winter base flow and the reduction from 20 CFS to 16 CFS, we would receive a range of savings from 1,800 to 2,500 acre feet. And this would give a combined savings of 5,700 to 9,000 acre feet. Just to recap, this is the final slide of the presentation. Our proposed TUCP recommendation for our application is to eliminate our first upstream migration flow, conduct an adaptive management period from November 15th to December 1st. From December 1st to December 15th, increase our base flows to the 16 CFS, coincident with an unregulated flow of greater than 25 CFS, or by December 15th, if no such flow has occurred. Reduce our winter base flow from 20 CFS to 16, and then resume our dry year flow schedule on April 1st. And this is all subject to potential modifications to increase flows throughout this period based on monitoring and adaptive management. That's what we have prepared for you today, and now I'll be taking any questions or comments.
Any comments from the board?
Yeah, I have just a question. I know that Sonoma Water has gone through the process themselves and gotten relief. What's your anticipation here? This seems to me to be a slam dunk, but I don't know what I don't know. So do you expect any problems with this, any resistance or any even negotiation?
Well, go ahead, Ben.
No, you do, Alicia. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, we have been meeting very regularly, and we've been doing a lot of outreach with our stakeholders to bring them along in the process. And we have been discussing regularly the monitoring and adaptive management actions that we would take in concert with this application. So the application is not just the recommendation, but it's also the adaptive management and monitoring plan, which we are confident that when we bring those two together as the whole, as a package, that we would hopefully be successful with the state in them granting this.
Okay.
Any other board comments?
I've got a couple. Alicia, do we have an actual deadline to get this filed coming up?
The first date that we would want to see a revised temporary urgency change take place is November 1st. And the state has requested approximately 60 days for review from time of application submittal for review, because they have their own process, which incorporates a public review period. And so that's really driving the schedule and has been driving the schedule since we started the study in April. So we really do need, if we're going to move forward with the TUCP this coming winter, we really do need to file this application next week.
Yeah. So on this project, I do see an actual urgency, which I didn't see on the Intertie project. So we're facing a filing deadline in order to meet state requirements, correct?
That's correct.
And then I'm sure you've seen some of the comment letters that came in last week. One of which from Save Our Seashore refers to a 1988 study that was done for the WR 9517 agreement. And I'm just wondering whether we've updated that study to account for the habitat restoration work that's been done. So that old study indicated a 19% reduction in REDS for a reduced flow from 25 to 20. But since that time, there's been considerable habitat recreate habitat construction effectively, and which would increase available spawning ground for the reds. So, I'm just wondering whether we've got an updated study that we could use as far as documenting what the actual impacts are going to be.
I'll let Sean field that question.
Yeah, thank you. Sean Horn, I'm Watershed Resource Manager. That's a really good, interesting question, Director Brackman. The study that we did for the temporary urgency change petition was really focused on what we could evaluate and consider in regards to a temporary change to our water board order. It wasn't intended to replace the 1980 study or update it. However, it does give us a basis to build off of and better understand the system. They didn't overlap with the sites that were done in 88. Andy might be able to speak more directly to the sites and how they were chosen, but we would need to go through a more thorough process to really update that 88 study in relationship to the habitat improvements that have been carried out to date. I will say that going forward, we are very much considering our restoration actions within the context of drought conditions and how to improve spawning habitat within the system as a whole. So that's definitely a focus of the current restoration designs that we're working on now.
And then as far as monitoring is concerned, you indicated there's going to be weekly monitoring to kind of keep an eye on things. So are we going to be doing that? Is our staff going to be doing that? And, is that done by visual inspection? How is that done?
Yeah, so there's a number of different methods we'll be using during our monitoring. We're really building off of a robust monitoring program that the district already has in place and adding additional components to it to be more cautious about the conditional changes that we're seeing. And to do that, we're going to bring on additional support within our staffing. So we're doing that through additional seasonal aids, through our watershed stewardship program participants that come to us through the California Conservation Corps. And then also through a partnership with the Marin RCD, we're doing a small contract to help carry out our ongoing monitoring activities. And then we have intentions to also supplement our monitoring with some additional technical surveys from ESA as part of this study review, so that we can continue to hone in on the conditions and the changes that are occurring under these reduced flow scenarios to better understand the system.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a little bit reassuring. So thanks. And thanks for the explanation.
Any other board comments? I'll chime in here a couple of things. I really appreciate the hard work that staff and consultants have done to quickly assess this this study and the potential impacts, and how to look at this as yet another one of our tools that we're trying to enact because we are in such dire circumstances with our water. And when it's dry like this, it's not only an impact on people, but it's also an impact on fish and wildlife. And there's a couple of things about the study that I think I'm a little concerned about, that I've talked with folks about, and I think I'm able to work past. But I am concerned that we are looking at recent historic salmon return numbers, because while nobody can predict salmon return numbers, if you could play the stock market and make a lot of money or something. It's very, very difficult to predict. But when we do get big returns, those big returns are so important to the longevity and the health of the larger population. I'm concerned that we're more or less planning around a bottom end than a stronger return. And we don't know, but I feel concerned about that. Secondly, in terms of the habitat suitability analyses that we're using to come up with a 16 CFS release, I'm concerned that we did not look at flows that were higher than 20 CFS in the analysis, because part of that methodology is looking for breakpoints in the curves of decreasing stream flow and loss of habitat. And when we don't look at higher flows, we can't see the full spectrum of where we are on breaks and curves. And I just think that again, while we probably are catching, I don't think that the analyses are necessarily wrong, but we're sort of measuring the impact of low flows on low volumes of habitat we're not really seeing that we may be already missing a lot of habitat potential that exists in the stream at higher flows. Now we don't have higher flows to release, but without knowing that full spectrum of flows, the analysis is a little bit skewed, I think. I do think, though, that given that we are in a really critical dry year and knowing that the fisheries agencies who are responsible for ensuring that we are not having a substantial impact on listed species, that I know that they are going to be looking at our application very, very closely, and I doubt that it is a slam dunk. I think that it shouldn't be a slam dunk. It should be very, very carefully considered. Because we're talking about listed species populations that are crashing and threatened with extinction, and so we really shouldn't be looking at that in any other way than something that we're not contributing to extinction, but we are trying to make it through this year, both fish and people. So I can part with those comments. Any other
I just want to
board
take a
comments?
minute before we move on, just to support Monty's. I don't have Monty's technical expertise, but I have litigated successfully endangered salmon listings. And so my concern comes from that policy perspective. I'm not questioning the good work of staff, but I am concerned for the reasons that Monty laid out. These are endangered species. This feels like a fairly aggressive approach. So I have concerns. I'll be interested also to see what the fisheries agencies say. I think I'm going to abstain on this. I feel like I just don't have enough information to be comfortable truly supporting this at this time. But I understand, Alicia, the timing that you've laid out. So yeah, I understand it, but I'm concerned given the fact that we're dealing with species that have been listed for some time and have not really shown much recovery to date. Yeah.
And I guess I want to say just one more point, because it's an important time to make these statements, is that, as Director Bregman pointed out, we have done a lot of great work over the past couple of decades to restore habitat in Lagunitas Creek, and there's a benefit to that we need to understand. And I think that there have been shifts in what we're seeing in terms of hydrology and just the timing of arrival of fish. I think that we do need to understand better the benefits of the work that we've done and how we might want to manage our releases more effectively. And I would encourage us, at some near point in time to do a more robust study, maybe leveraging the work that has been done to look at how we can be more effective with our flow releases to get a bigger benefit, at a more effective use of the water that we are putting downstream. No other board comments, so we can open it up to public comment. Are there any comments, Terry?
Yes, we have 4 comments. The first 2, Jerry Morel and Phil Sauter, please.
Thank you. The presentation today made it perfectly clear that these reduced flows will harm the fish. The key graphs were the ones showing the amount of wetted habitat, essentially, that will decline for the salmon and steelhead. And no matter what else has been said in this vast cloud of graphs, there's no question that this has at least a high potential to harm the fish. Picture yourselves as the Marin Water District going to the State Water Board and saying, we want to reduce fish flows that you've previously approved that were viewed as protective for the fish because our customers are not conserving as much water as we think should be conserved. Your goal is a 40% reduction in the amount of water being used by your customers, and yet they're only at 29%. And what you're going to have to tell the water board is, well, our customers aren't doing what we think they should do, and what in fact many other customers are doing in many other water districts, and therefore we want to take water away from the fish. I think that's going to be a very weak argument to the water board. If you were doing more in conservation, you'd have a stronger argument. And so I would urge you, by the way, on behalf of the Environmental Action Committee of West Marin, which I'm a member of the board of, not to proceed with this at this time, but to reserve taking water away from the fish until that point at which your customers are conserving at least as much as the goal you've set as a board of directors.
Thank you. Mr. Phil Sauter. Hello, sir.
Okay, yeah, my name's Phil Sauter. I live in Woodacre. I'm speaking for myself today and not for an organization. I appreciate the care that went into this analysis and the thoughtfulness of the responses. I was glad to see defined pauses to look at actual conditions and make real-time adjustments if needed. At the end of the day, though, this is a document that asks how much water we can take from an endangered species without pushing it over the edge. I found myself wishing we had a similar document that asks how much water we can take from our human customers without pushing them over the edge. 10 years ago, the district was using 41 million gallons a day as its daily summer average usage. Today, we're using 31 million gallons as a summer baseline, and we're looking to cut that in half. But so far, I haven't laid my hands on an analysis of exactly how we got to 31 million gallons and exactly how we'll get the rest of the way to our goal. How much is car washes? How much is leaks? How much is lawns? How much is swimming pools? Do 20% of our customers use 80% of our water, and what do they use it for? This isn't an idle question. If my math is right, for every additional 10% we save from human usage, we can release an additional 4 CFS for the fish. A month with an extra 10% conservation is a month of releases 4 CFS higher than are in this plan. Or we could release 16 CFS a week earlier than planned. I'd like to see a study of how we can conserve that extra 10% of human usage and build in an extra layer of protection for the fish. What sacrifices do we need to make, and how can we make them less onerous for most users? Could 40% conservation start to look like the good old days and 50% become the new norm? And exactly how will we get there? If the board does forward this request, I'd suggest that the district also forward a companion commitment to do a detailed study of human conservation. And based on the results, commit to release some of those human savings into the creek to increase the survival chances for the fish. I'll also suggest that we communicate this analysis and commitment to our customers. Building awareness that we share this watershed with other species could give us an additional reason to conserve and build a sense of urgency that I think we desperately need. And finally, I enjoy crunching numbers, and I'll gladly volunteer to help with this analysis where I can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Gordon Bennett, then Roger Roberts, please. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Gordon Bennett. I'll come back to you, sir. Mr. Roger Roberts.
My concern is summertime flows. And I have a very simple question. What is the confidence level that we have for the summertime flows that are being projected and their impact on temperature of the water in Lagunitas Creek? Because there's a high correlation between temperature of the water and the oxygenation levels of the creek, and therefore the survivability of the fry. So what is our confidence level in summertime flow projections that you are proposing?
So that's part of what's driving this recommendation as well. Given that we don't know what's going to happen this coming winter, we really want to stretch our supplies for as long as possible to be able to meet those summer flows. We're not currently recommending any changes to those summer flows that are stipulated in the water board, but we want to ensure that we have sufficient supplies to meet those throughout that summer period. So that is some of the reasoning behind going through this flow study process and seeing if there are changes that can be made during the winter that would have less effects on the fish during the winter period, so we can meet those requirements and those conditions that the fish need to survive during the summer period.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to highlight that because I think that that's a really important part of understanding this is that if we run into if our dire projections that we are using to make decisions about our water supply projects bear out, another impact is our ability to actually release flows to the stream for fish. And so I think it's an important thing to realize that is the future that we are trying to avoid, and conserving water now wherever we can is tied to what we will have in terms of water, I think, coming forward into the drier parts of next year.
Okay, Mr. Gordon Bennett, then Barbara Salzman, then Frank Egger. Mr. Bennett, are you here, sir?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you for reading my Save Our Seashore letter. At least some people did. I appreciate that. It's a technical analysis, and I want to go back to something that Director Schmidt said. We don't have data from the 25 CFS. We're relying on the Bradovich data from 1988. And that shows about a 19% reduction. And that is in addition to the reduction from 20 to 16 that's been proposed by ESA. So it's cumulatively a rather large reduction. And if indeed we have improved habitat in the creek, then the Bradovich number the reduction could be higher. So it's potentially a significant impact that you're going to be presenting to the Water Board. And the Water Board has already seen the Bradovich data from the 20 CFS to the 16 CFS. They've seen that and they've rejected that. And the ESA data from 20 to 16 is virtually equivalent to the Bradovich data. So you could be going over old ground with the Water Board in a reduction to 16 CFS. What will not be going over new ground is the proposal to delay the base flow. And that's one that I support. I think you could go ahead with that. I think there's minimum impact on the coho from that aspect. But I think you're going to run into trouble from my environmental colleagues and the Water Board with the second part, which is the reduction in the base flow. So I'm suggesting that there's a half a loaf to be consumed here. You might go ahead now with the delay part of this and then hold off, as my friend Jerry Merrill said, with the second part of it until you get a better conservation effort from your customers. So that's my suggestion. It's a halfway compromise. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just clarify one thing for everyone's sake, is that the 25 CFS that's being referenced is for a portion of the winter base flow. It's for 3 months. The winter base flow is for a 6-month period. The study that was done by in the 80s was really looking at long-term water board flow releases and what would be put in there. This is really for a temporary state of 180 days. So this would just be for that period. And it does base itself off of what our dry year flows are currently, which are 20 CFS.
Ms. Barbara Salzman, please.
Hi. I would like to first commend or support the comments made so far regarding conservation. I think your case would be much stronger going to the state board if your conservation program was stronger. So I would urge you in the meantime here to shore up your efforts in that regard. But I wanted to emphasize some quotes from the National Marine Fishery Service letter of August 27th. So I assume because it's pretty recent that it's not anything from the meetings that have been held with agencies has been incorporated here. What they say, and some of you probably have read this, is they expect impacts to increase with the proposed decreases in base flows to 16 CFS. Thus, the implications of reducing flows on red superimposition should be studied further. And they suggest that including triggers and provisions for adjusted flow conditions to minimize impacts to salmonids. They recommend a number of triggers related to temperature, DO, velocity, water surface level over reds, etc. And they propose that once the thresholds are reached, flow should be increased to 24 hours to levels increase within 24 hours to levels agreed upon in the monitoring plan to avoid or minimize potential impacts to listed fish species. So I don't know, I didn't hear any reference to those provisions to compensate for the anticipated impacts to salmonid. So maybe you can address that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to clarify, Barbara. Those recommendations are incorporated into our current version of our monitoring plan, and they will be addressed as listed for the NOAA order, for the NOAA letter, excuse me. So we have been in constant communication with them, especially during the past few weeks and last week as well. And those current recommendations to increase within the 24 hours and have all of those triggers to be studied and monitored are currently incorporated into our monitoring plan recommendation.
Good.
So Alicia, I think that this is helpful, is that I think you're, for a lot of us who are not part of these conversations, you folks are having a lot of dialogues with the National Marine Fisheries Service, as well as the Water Board and CDFW,
Correct.
among others.
Correct.
So I think that a lot of the concern, a lot of what I think myself and probably others are looking at is trusting these agencies with their responsibilities to really assess these and by the right yardstick, so to speak, of relative impact. And I guess to the extent that you feel like you have heard their concerns and are addressing them as part of the monitoring plan and adaptive management, is that, I'm hearing that's the case with NIMS. Is that the case also with the Water Board and with CDFW?
That's correct. We've been really wanting to hear them and incorporate their comments as we've gone through this study, and it won't end once we file the application. We'll be in continuous conversation with them on a minimum weekly basis, giving them updates as to our reporting, or more frequently if the conditions change unexpectedly. We'll be providing them all of the data that we'll be collecting, as well as the visual observations, and moving forward, on a frequent reporting basis throughout this period. So it's not going to stop if we get approved to file the application. This will be a continuous conversation that's only really just beginning.
Okay. And they can also come back and require additional requirements in order to secure approval, which could be any number of things. So in essence, what is being put forward here is not what necessarily will be approved. Something else could come back.
Yeah, I'll chime in right here, Monty, or Director Schmidt. With our meetings with the State Board, we've reviewed our approach as it is, and we've discussed the coordination that we've been having with the other agencies and the input they've given us in regards to triggers and adaptive management. They fully understand and are supportive of those triggers going into the TUCP. They would be written into the TUCP as conditions that we have to follow and comply with, as well as the weekly monitoring and reporting out to our agency partners. And then additionally, the State Board has signaled that there's a review period to solicit additional comments should there be additional input that they need to get from agencies and stakeholders. They could then build into that TUCP monitoring period as well. So all the elements that we've highlighted in our monitoring plan, that large table, the green highlighted new monitoring elements will be built into that TUCP plan that the State Board would be issuing.
So just for clarification, Monty, would there be possible increased flows to compensate for the conditions observed on the ground?
Correct, Director Bragman. That's part of our adaptive management. So we built that in. If there are triggers that are identified through our monitoring work, then we'd consult with our agency staff, agency partners, and then our monitoring plan actually identifies a 1 to 2 CFS increase to see how the responses are, and then continuing to monitor based on those increases.
Okay, thanks.
I have a last speaker if you want to. Frank Egger.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Mr. Egger.
Thank you, Frank Egger for Fairfax. Since 50% of the watershed of Lagunas Creek's cohosts spawning and rearing streams were blocked by Seeger Dam? Why is Nicasio Creek, a major tributary of Lagunitas Creek, not part of the flow equation? That's a question. And you know, we seem to want to place a lot of trust in National Marine Fisheries Service. Both NOAA and NIMS were compromised by the Trump administration. Has President Biden managed to turn that agency back to her pro-fish positions? I'm just concerned about where they are on fishery issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other comments, Terry?
There are no more comments.
Okay, I believe this is where we put it to a vote. The board.
So, you know, Monty, just a comment, I'm going to move approval, but I think this process really illustrates one of the many suboptimal alternatives that we're facing. So it's kind of with a heavy heart and a lot of concern that I'm moving approval, but I have confidence that the continuing monitoring will be done diligently. And maybe the program, if we communicate it correctly to our customers, will inspire them to increase conservation, because it certainly illustrates the connection between consumption and the environment. So I'm gonna move approval.
Okay. I'll second that. I was there at the creation of this in 1995. So I think it's obviously over the last 25 years been for the good. And twice before, I believe, we have submitted a proposal similar to this, and both times backed off. So quite frankly, I'm very secure in the responsibility coming from all sides in making the final determination of this. And I 100% agree with Larry's suggestion that this presents a conservation marketing opportunity, and we should utilize that. It's there. It makes a point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that this is true, but I think it is also, I think Director Bragman, your deep concern about being in this situation and the trade-off that we are needing to consider here troubles me deeply. And I really know, though, that the Lagunitas TAC has been very engaged in this process, and it is a very, very committed group of very intelligent people who have been working with our staff over all these months, providing very strong critique, as I've seen. And I think what has come out of this process is the best of the worst situation, maybe is the way to put it.
Yeah.
So, okay, go for a vote.
Director Bragman,
Aye.
Director Gibson,
Aye.
Director Kohler,
You're
Dr.
muted,
Kohler?
Cynthia.
Way to
Sorry, I abstain.
satisfy all of these different perspectives.
Director Russell,
Let me
Aye.
back up a little bit.
and Vice Chair Schmidt.
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, we're on to our next agenda item, which is to the Berry Lane pipe replacement project.
Thank you, Director Schmidt. So now that we've gotten through all of these drought issues, we're back to our normal business of capital infrastructure improvements. And I'm going to let Matt present this one on Berry Lane.
Crystal, I'm going to interrupt just for a minute. I'm about 12 minutes past my meeting, so I'm going to have to sign off for the rest of this meeting, but I'm just going to offer that I've reviewed the packet and I support all of the following items, and if I were able to be here, I would vote to move them forward to the board.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day and a good
I think
weekend.
a number of us are starting to run into time constraints, myself included. So if we could, for the good of all people here, if we could move through these topics pretty quickly.
Okay, great. Matt, go ahead.
I'll be quick. Good morning. My name is Matt Steiner, Assistant Engineer with the Design Department, and I'm here to present Berry Lane Pipeline Replacement Project. This project will replace 350 feet of leak-prone cast iron pipe on Berry Lane and replace one service on Skyland Way, all in the town of Ross. On August 10th, district staff opened 4 bids for the pipeline replacement project. Magoria and Gelati submitted the lowest bid at their contract price of $151,333, but failed to include a signed copy of addendum number 2 with their contract bid. After staff and legal review, it was determined that the board has the right to waive this irregularity and award the contract to the lowest bidder. District staff requests that the operations committee refer and recommend waiver of the minor bid irregularity and award this contract to Magoria and Gelati Incorporated at a future board meeting.
Okay, thank you. Any board comments?
So this considered a trivial defect by legal?
That's correct, Director Bragman. We looked specifically at the language in addendum 2 and found that it could not influence a bid amount or release the bidder from their bid, and found that it could be waived by the board as a minor.
And we didn't have any objections from any of the other bidders about it, did we?
Not that I've heard of. I would
Okay.
defer.
Okay.
Any other board comments?
Move approval.
Public? We got public comments?
There are none.
Okay. Do we have a vote?
Second.
Move approval?
Yeah.
Second?
And this is a review and refer, so
Yeah.
we don't need to do it. Okay, so we're good.
Right.
Yeah.
We can move on to the next item.
Okay, thank you. All right, our next item is the construction inspection support services.
Hi, good afternoon.
Alex has this one.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, directors. I'm Alex and I, engineer manager for the design section. I'll keep this short and sweet. Recently, the district implemented a drought wastewater monitoring program that needed patrol to address wastewater in response to the district's recent landscape ordinance. In response to the district's needs, one of our construction inspectors was temporarily reassigned to manage and coordinate the wastewater patrols, along with staff scheduling, wastewater violation follow-ups and actions. As a result, that temporarily left the construction management group short one inspector to provide continued construction inspection services for the district's capital, fire flow reimbursable and subdivision projects. As a result, district staff issued a request for proposal to 4 different construction inspection firms and received 2 on August 13th. After staff reviewed the 2 proposals and evaluated the experience, qualifications, construction support services and availability of the firms, district staff concluded that SOMA's provided the team that best met the experience and requirements we were looking for our water projects. That being said, district staff recommends that the operations committee review and refer the award of the professional service agreement for construction inspection support services at a future regularly scheduled board meeting. And I'll take any questions now.
Questions from the board?
None from me.
Okay.
None for me.
Public comment?
There are none.
Okay. So we move approval to move it to the review to refer to the board?
Yes,
Correct.
Vice Chair, we would just need a first and a second to do that.
Okay, I'll
Second. Okay.
I got it. Thank you.
Okay, all right. If nothing else, I think that's everything we have. We will adjourn.
Thank you all. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank
folks.
you all.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Yep.